Hugo, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to you, and welcome back to our continuing coverage here on Newsroom Channel 405 from Santon. Well, of course, the big expectation is the first public statement about this BRICS summit by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Some opening remarks, if you will, to set the tone for the discussions. We are expecting some public comment of some way, shape or form from the other leaders here as well, including possibly a virtual contribution from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Several questions as well, of course, already about the focus of this BRICS summit. We do expect representatives of the South African government to have conversations as well about how, for example, the summit may help small business, issues like that. Also, just to take a moment, as I think many people will be now, hearing the passing of Derek Watts, someone who had played an immense role in our society, partly simply because of how long he had been a part of the lives of so many people in South Africa. Sunday nights for many were marked by Derek Watts passing today, as you would have seen earlier. Well, Sanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue with us today, of course, looking ahead to what we are expecting in the next hour or so. So, Sanusha, as always with these summits, there's a lot of hurry up and wait. This is the nature of things. There's a lot of discussions in the background, a lot of business being done, a lot of T's being crossed and I's being dotted, and sometimes even the occasional full stop being put in and the inverted commas being taken out. Is there going to be a flurry of activity just ahead of the heads of state speaking?
Well, I think that there's definitely last-minute issues that will probably be discussed. Let me go back to 2013 when South Africa hosted the first summit. I remember the gala dinner was at 7 p.m. They only started at 11 p.m. because they were still negotiating particular plenaries, particular issues. And it was quite an intense issue around particular questions around who wanted what, where the parenthesis was, where the comma was, what did it imply. So I hope this is not going to be this. But I think they've been on track on this summit. I think there's going to be a lot of questions around whether or not they are going to still have some last-minute kind of negotiations on particular questions that may be sensitive. But I get the feeling that they're going to stick to time.
They're certainly going to try to, I would think, because everybody wants that moment, right? And for President Ramaphosa, this is an important moment. As host, sure, smallest economy, but a real moment in the sun.
Absolutely. The last time he chaired a big institution was the AU, and that was virtual. And we saw, a serendipitous moment with the pandemic that pushed South Africa to be the champion of the question of vaccine access and the intellectual property rights question on production of vaccine. So I think this is a very big moment. It's a legitimizing moment for President Ramaphosa because it's also about him coming through the body blows he's taking at the domestic level and fielding the issue around how much the question of President Putin, the ICC and the arrest warrant was much more overwhelming the BRICS summit. So it's actually now, we're actually talking about BRICS and what BRICS is going to do going forward. So it is a very, very strategic moment for him, but it's also a strategic moment for his presidency.
I'm always intrigued when you look at heads of state from representing different societies on stage at the same time, often have come to power in very different ways, have particular life experiences, and yet are also, by the fact that they're there, very, very good political operators. Do you think they're the only people they're ever honest with?
No. I think they play their cards very close to their chest. I mean, what we're going to see when President Ramaphosa opens this summit in a couple of minutes or whenever he does, and then, of course, the interventions by the other leaders, is we're going to see a lot of symbolic camaraderie. And they're going to basically kind of hug each other and say, we haven't seen each other for 4 years. We've now come together as the BRICS family, of course, one virtually. And the point about this is that at the end of the day, they still kind of circle each other. They're not 100% in terms of saying, oh yeah, no, we all part of the BRICS family, and it's very important. But remember, the politics of politics is politics. The interest of interest is interest. So these are core issues that will inform how they see each other. And I think it's very important that this summit is happening at a time when the whole international system is in a state of inflection. It's at a state of unpredictability. And I've never seen so much of a tension on the BRICS or any global South grouping like this in many, many years.
Why is there so much tension compared to previous times? And I mean, for some people in the West, they would say immediately, that's because of Russia.
Well, I think Russia is the mask on this issue. It's really China. If China wasn't in the BRICS, would we have a tension like this? Would we talk about this challenge between the US and China? Would we talk about the fact that China represents a serious issue in terms of how it has globally institutionalized its rise through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Global Development Initiative, through the Global Security Initiative, and now through the Global Civilizational Initiative. And the BRICS represents one of those institutional spaces. So it's really China. China is, you got almost the equivalent of the most powerful man in South Africa, which is Xi Jinping, to Joe Biden. It's massive.
It's so interesting because, there are plenty of people who would say one of the problems with the world is it's a sort of unipolar. The West can project power. The United States really can project power. And that's about a lot of things. It's about the size of their economy. It's also about aircraft carriers because it's about that. And yet, is there any point in replacing the US with China? If you decide that you're not going to be as close to the West anymore or to the US, is there any point of now suddenly you're beholden to China? There could be some arguments for a change every now and then. Obviously, what you should really aim to do is to do both.
Yeah, you should hedge.
Yeah. And
it's about your strategic autonomy. It's about not putting all of your interests in one particular global configuration. And that's what happened after 1945. It was the way the world kind of underpinned itself in terms of the rules-based system. Now we know that rules-based system works, but it doesn't work. It's not as inclusive in the way that you want it to be. That doesn't mean that if you want to create, the BRICS is going to create the panacea for the entire international system. I think you've got to be cautious, you've got to be careful, you've got to be smart, and you've got to be strategic. Your transactional foreign policy has to be underpinned by strategic foreign policy thinking. Don't be blind. Don't run blindly into the ocean and think, hang on, it's not going to throw us out again. So I think you've got to be careful in saying that this is now a replacing of the international system. What the BRICS and what possibly is happening with its configuration and the way it's aligning in terms of saying that the global south has to be recognized is that we have one playing field. Yeah, it works, but it doesn't work in the way that we want it to work, or it keeps us out in certain ways and contexts in terms of the reform. So we create an adjacent playing field. Doesn't mean that the rules are going to be different. It's just how do you manage those rules.
Well, not many people can play rugby and cricket and football at the same time. Within all of that, one of the sort of startling things about the kind of order that we have, the Bretton Woods system, if you like, is that it was formed in the aftermath, really, as World War II was coming to a close. So it was formed in a time of great conflict. One of the problems, that's one of the reasons I made the point earlier that Britain and France really shouldn't be on the UN Security Council, but because of what was happening at the time, they were given those seats. What I'm trying to get to is it's actually very hard outside of a conflict. It's like, how often do countries draw up new constitutions? Usually after conflicts. How hard is it to change the world system without a conflict? Actually very difficult. And isn't that the struggle we're seeing now?
Yeah. Just on the question of trying to play rugby and soccer, rugby came out of soccer in some way. So the point is that, yes, you're right. In every historical event that has happened, there's been conflict that has led to change. So the only constant in the international system is change that comes through conflict. And the problem, I think, is that the world of 1990, whether you want to choose the Fukuyama end of history thesis or not, the real issue right now is that the 2007-2008 financial crisis produced the G20. Is that we have a conflict in the financial market, but it's everybody's responsibility of the most the most richest country, the G20, that need to take responsibility. The problem with this is that responsibility has to be shared even when you actually are not responsible for the conflict. World War II, you're not responsible for it. So at the end of the day, what is important, I think, for us to bear in mind is that this change is painful, but it's necessary. It has to happen. And that change that you're talking about is that the system was never built for peaceful coexistence and change. It was built on a conflictual framework.
So then, of course, if we had to all sit down, and one of the funny things about trying to invent global systems is that they're all a result of history. It's a bit like a car. You would never sit down now and say, well, we want to move lots of people around, let's give each one of them a car. It's not what you would do.
No.
But because of the history of where systems come from, this is what we ended up with, and we have to manage what we have. So that also means that all future human systems of interaction between nation states are probably going to be imperfect in some way, shape or form, and actually always quite difficult to change because they serve certain interests. So they may serve the interests of the US now, dollarization does, but that also makes it very hard to change.
Yeah, yes, and I think to a large extent, if you continue in the current trajectory of how system change works, if you take Emmanuel Wallerstein's debate about world systems approaches and so forth, and he came back and he kind of revised that in terms of the rise of China. The real issue, I think, is now how do we deal with a system where climate change is really the big disruptor to the entire global architecture. So we can talk about institutions, we can talk about rules-based, we can talk about the way you want to trade and the inclusivity and the systems reform approach or transformation approach. But the structural conditions that currently exist in the international system today is that we have to understand what climate change means. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, made a very interesting statement not so long ago. He said, it's no longer global warming, it's global boiling. And global boiling means a system reconfiguration or change has to understand what these rules-based system means in terms of trade, consumption, and development. So I think what we're having is a very interesting debate about what the BRICS are representing in terms of jostling the system, in terms of opening up and perhaps giving a kind of jostle to the system to say, hello, the Global South does exist, even if you didn't see it for 75 years. But what is also important to understand is that in all of this, nobody wins with global change, global climate change and the impact.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of different views, as you know, about BRICS. I'm sure you have your own view about whether it will make a difference to you or not. Let's hear the views of some South Africans as we're hosting the BRICS Head of State Summit here in Sandton.